My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and today I want to speak to you from my heart. Before you decide whether you agree with me or disagree with me, I ask only one thing: listen until the end. Because what I am about to say is not directed at one church, one country, one political party, or one denomination. It is not an attack on Christianity. It is not an attack on Jesus Christ. In fact, it is the exact opposite. What I want to talk about is something that has troubled me deeply for a long time. Something I can no longer ignore. Something that may be affecting Africa, America, and many other parts of the world far more than we realize. In February of 2026, I attended the African Youth Conference on Ethics, Faith, and the Future in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. More than 15,000 people gathered in person. Millions more followed online. Young people came with hope. Religious leaders came with confidence. Government officials came with prepared speeches. But before I stood before that audience, I spent several hours reviewing reports that had been delivered to me. Those reports left me disturbed. They spoke about poverty. They spoke about corruption. They spoke about injustice. One number in particular stayed in my mind. More than 640 million Africans were still living below the poverty line. At the same time, tens of billions of dollars continued to disappear every year through corruption, abuse of power, and dishonest systems. As I continued reading, another reality became impossible to ignore. Many of the people responsible for exploiting ordinary citizens publicly identified themselves as believers. Some regularly attended church. Some quoted scripture. Some spoke openly about faith. Yet their actions brought suffering to the very people they claimed to serve. I also learned about religious leaders who possessed enormous wealth, while members of their congregations struggled to buy food, pay school fees, or obtain medical care. The contrast was painful. The more I reflected on these realities, the more one question echoed in my mind. Why do so many people read the Bible every day while injustice continues to grow? Why do so many people speak about Jesus while living in ways completely opposite to what he taught? That question followed me onto the stage that day, and it follows me even now as I speak to you. I am not here to present myself as a perfect man. I am not here to claim that I possess all the answers. I am simply a man who believes that difficult questions must be asked when silence becomes dangerous. Because if faith cannot transform how we treat people, then what is its purpose? If we honor God with our words but harm others with our actions, what message are we truly sending? These questions are not only for politicians. They are not only for pastors. They are not only for wealthy people. They are for all of us, including me, including you. And what I discovered as I searched for answers may be uncomfortable to hear. But sometimes the truth that changes our lives is the truth that first makes us uncomfortable. So, allow me to share what I have learned. Because this message may be about far more than Christians. It may be about every one of us. I do not condemn Jesus, I condemn hypocrisy. As I stood before that audience in Ouagadougou, I knew that some people would misunderstand my words before they even heard them. That is often what happens whenever difficult truths are spoken. Some people immediately assume that any criticism directed toward religious behavior must be an attack on religion itself. Others believe that exposing hypocrisy means rejecting faith. I reject both ideas. Let me be very clear. I am not speaking against Jesus Christ. I am not speaking against sincere believers. I am not speaking against the Christian faith. What I am speaking against is hypocrisy. Because hypocrisy has damaged societies more than many people realize. Hypocrisy destroys trust. Hypocrisy weakens communities. Hypocrisy causes people to lose faith not only in leaders but sometimes even in God. And that should concern every person who claims to follow Jesus. When I read the teachings of Jesus, I do not see a man who encouraged corruption. I do not see a man who praised greed. I do not see a man who taught people to exploit the poor. I see a man who spoke about compassion. I see a man who defended the weak. I see a man who challenged the powerful whenever they abused their authority. I see a man who consistently placed truth above popularity. That is why I find it impossible to use the name of Jesus to justify injustice. Throughout history, some people have done exactly that. They have carried religious symbols while oppressing others. They have spoken holy words while committing dishonest acts. They have presented themselves as servants of God while behaving like masters over other people. This problem is not limited to one country. It is not limited to Africa. It exists in wealthy nations. It exists in developing nations. It exists wherever human beings allow pride to become stronger than conscience. I have met ordinary citizens who work hard every day, treat others with dignity, and quietly help those in need. Many of these people never appear on television. Many never receive awards. Many will never become famous. Yet their lives reflect the values that Jesus taught far more than some public figures who constantly speak about religion. That reality should make all of us think. Because faith is not measured by visibility. Faith is not measured by how loudly a person speaks. Faith is not measured by how many people applaud. Faith is revealed by character. It is revealed when nobody is watching. It is revealed when personal gain conflicts with moral responsibility. It is revealed when doing the right thing becomes difficult. One of the greatest dangers facing modern society is the temptation to replace genuine faith with religious appearance. Appearance is easy. Transformation is difficult. Anyone can learn religious language. Anyone can memorize verses. Anyone can participate in ceremonies. But becoming an honest person requires daily effort. Becoming a compassionate person requires sacrifice. Becoming a servant of others requires humility. Those qualities cannot be purchased. They cannot be manufactured for public relations campaigns. They cannot be created through speeches alone. They must be lived. This is where hypocrisy reveals itself. Hypocrisy occurs when there is a large distance between what a person says and what a person does. The larger that distance becomes, the more damage it causes. People notice. Children notice. Young adults notice. Communities notice. And eventually they begin asking dangerous questions. If religious leaders do not follow their own teachings, why should anyone else? If public officials speak about morality while engaging in corruption, why should citizens trust them? If people claim to love their neighbors while actively harming them, what does love even mean? These questions are not signs of rebellion. Often they are signs of disappointment. And disappointment can be extremely destructive. I have spoken with many young Africans who are frustrated, not because they reject faith, not because they reject God, but because they see too many contradictions. They hear messages about honesty, then they witness dishonesty. They hear messages about service, then they witness selfishness. They hear messages about sacrifice, then they witness luxury built upon the suffering of others. These contradictions create confusion, and confusion eventually creates cynicism. When cynicism spreads through a generation, society pays a heavy price. People stop believing that integrity matters. People stop believing that justice is possible. People stop believing that good leadership exists. That is why hypocrisy must be confronted, not out of hatred, not out of anger, but out of concern for the future. I often hear people say that the greatest threat to faith is atheism. Personally, I see things differently. I am not afraid of people who openly say they do not believe. At least they are being honest about their position. Honesty allows conversation. Honesty allows understanding. Honesty allows respect even when disagreement exists. What concerns me far more are people who publicly wear the name of God while privately practicing oppression. Because those individuals create confusion for everyone around them. They make evil appear righteous. They make selfishness appear holy. They make exploitation appear acceptable. And when that happens, faith itself becomes associated with behavior that completely contradicts its purpose. The damage extends far beyond religion. It reaches politics. It reaches education. It reaches business. It reaches families. Every institution suffers when hypocrisy becomes normal. The tragedy is that many hypocrites do not even recognize what they have become. Human beings possess a remarkable ability to justify their own actions. We excuse our behavior. We minimize our faults. We compare ourselves only to people who behave worse. And slowly we begin believing our own excuses. That process is dangerous, because self-deception is often more destructive than deception directed toward others. A person who lies to others may eventually be exposed. A person who lies to himself may continue for years without recognizing the truth. That is why self-examination is so important. Every believer should ask difficult questions. Am I treating people fairly? Am I living according to the principles I claim to believe? Am I serving others or merely serving myself? Am I pursuing truth or merely protecting my image? These questions are uncomfortable, but growth rarely occurs without discomfort. I have had to ask myself these same questions. As a leader, I cannot demand accountability from others while refusing to examine my own conduct. That would be hypocrisy as well. Leadership does not remove responsibility. Leadership increases responsibility. The higher a person rises, the greater the obligation to remain honest. Power tests character. Influence tests character. Success tests character. And many people fail those tests because they become more concerned with preserving status than preserving integrity. History provides countless examples. Nations have fallen because leaders lost their moral compass. Institutions have collapsed because appearances became more important than principles. Organizations have failed because truth was sacrificed for convenience. The lesson remains the same. Without integrity, no structure can remain strong forever. This applies to governments. It applies to churches. It applies to businesses. It applies to families. And it applies to individuals. When integrity disappears, decline eventually follows. That is why I felt compelled to speak openly. Not because I enjoy criticism, not because I seek controversy, but because silence would be easier than honesty. And when good people remain silent about hypocrisy, hypocrisy becomes stronger. I believe many sincere Christians understand exactly what I am saying. They feel the same frustration. They see the same contradictions. They recognize the same dangers. Many faithful believers spend their lives serving others quietly. They care for the sick. They support struggling families. They encourage those who have lost hope. They give without seeking recognition. These people deserve respect. Their example deserves recognition because they demonstrate what faith can accomplish when it is genuine. Their lives remind us that Christianity is not the problem. The problem is hypocrisy. The problem is using faith as a mask instead of allowing faith to transform the heart. The problem is claiming devotion while practicing injustice. The problem is speaking about love while creating suffering. That is the truth I wanted people to hear. And before we can address the deeper problems facing our societies, we must first understand this foundation. The issue is not Jesus. The issue is not faith. The issue is the gap between belief and behavior. And until we confront that gap honestly, many of the problems we blame on politics, economics, or culture will continue to grow. Because every lasting change begins with character. Every lasting reform begins with truth. And every lasting truth begins with the courage to look honestly at ourselves. That is where this conversation must begin. And that is where our next challenge appears. Because once hypocrisy is recognized, we must ask how it shows itself in everyday life. One of the most common forms may be closer to us than we realize. It begins when people read scripture, attend church, pray publicly, and speak about God often, yet fail to practice what they claim to believe. That is the first dangerous habit we must confront. And that is what I want to discuss next. The central message is simple. I do not condemn Jesus Christ. I condemn hypocrisy. Because faith without integrity damages both society and the faith it claims to represent. Reading the Bible but not practicing it. After speaking about hypocrisy, I want to move to something even more personal. Because hypocrisy does not always begin with powerful people. It does not always begin with presidents, ministers, wealthy business owners, or famous religious figures. Sometimes it begins in ordinary daily life. Sometimes it begins with people who genuinely believe they are doing the right thing. That is what makes this issue so dangerous. The first habit I want us to examine is simple to describe but difficult to confront. Many people read the Bible. Many people attend church. Many people pray regularly. Many people speak openly about their faith. Yet their actions often tell a completely different story. This is not a new problem. It has existed for generations. But in many places today, it has become so common that people no longer recognize it. When I travel and meet citizens from different backgrounds, I often hear similar stories. Someone speaks passionately about God on Sunday. Then on Monday, that same person cheats customers in business. Someone leads prayers before a public event. Then later uses influence to secure unfair advantages. Someone quotes scripture online, then mistreats workers, employees, or neighbors. Someone speaks about righteousness, then participates in corruption when an opportunity appears. These contradictions are everywhere, and each contradiction weakens the credibility of faith. I want to be careful here. None of us are perfect. Every human being makes mistakes. Every human being falls short. That is not what I am talking about. I am not speaking about occasional failures. I am speaking about a consistent pattern in which religious activity becomes disconnected from moral behavior. That separation creates a serious problem, because faith was never intended to exist only inside buildings. Faith was never meant to be limited to ceremonies. Faith was never designed to appear only during worship services. Faith should influence how we live every day. It should affect how we treat family members. It should affect how we conduct business. It should affect how we exercise authority. It should affect how we respond when nobody is watching. Otherwise, what exactly is being transformed? This question deserves honest reflection. If a person spends years studying scripture but continues exploiting others, what has changed? If a person prays daily but continues lying whenever convenient, what has changed? If a person attends church faithfully but continues abusing power, what has changed? The answer may be uncomfortable. Sometimes religion changes habits without changing character. Sometimes people become skilled at religious performance while neglecting personal transformation. That distinction is important. Performance seeks approval. Transformation seeks truth. Performance focuses on appearance. Transformation focuses on character. Performance asks how others see us. Transformation asks who we really are. The difference may seem small. In reality, it changes everything. I remember speaking with a young man several years ago. He came from a humble background. His family had struggled financially for most of their lives. He worked hard and eventually found employment at a local business. At first, he was grateful. Then he began noticing something troubling. The owner regularly spoke about faith. The owner frequently attended church. The owner publicly donated money to religious causes. Yet employees were underpaid. Working conditions were poor. Promises were broken. People were treated unfairly. The young man asked me a question I've never forgotten. He said, "If this is what faith looks like, why should anyone believe in it?" That question stayed with me, not because it revealed a weakness in Christianity, but because it revealed the damage hypocrisy causes. The owner may have believed he was honoring God through public religious activities, yet his treatment of people communicated a very different message. The employees were not evaluating sermons. They were evaluating behavior, and behavior always speaks louder than words. Young people especially notice this. Many older generations wonder why some younger people are losing trust in institutions. Part of the answer is visible inconsistency. Young people observe what adults do. They compare actions with claims. When the gap becomes too large, trust begins to disappear. This happens in churches. It happens in governments. It happens in schools. It happens in families. Trust cannot survive indefinitely when words and actions constantly conflict. That is why this issue extends beyond religion. It affects society as a whole. Consider what happens when dishonesty becomes normalized. A business owner cheats customers. A government official accepts bribes. An employee steals from an employer. A contractor delivers poor work while charging full price. A citizen avoids responsibility whenever possible. Each person may justify the action. Each person may believe the impact is small. But millions of small acts of dishonesty eventually create national problems. Corruption rarely begins at the highest levels. It often begins with everyday decisions. It grows because people convince themselves that integrity no longer matters. Yet integrity always matters. No society can function properly without it. No economy can thrive without it. No community can remain united without it. No faith can remain credible without it. This is why reading scripture alone is not enough. Knowledge alone is not enough. Information alone is not enough. A person may memorize entire sections of the Bible. A person may know theological arguments. A person may understand religious history. But knowledge that never influences behavior becomes little more than information. Wisdom is different. Wisdom changes decisions. Wisdom changes priorities. Wisdom changes relationships. Wisdom changes conduct. That is why true faith should produce visible evidence. Not evidence measured by wealth. Not evidence measured by popularity. Not evidence measured by status. Evidence measured by character. Can people trust your word? Can people rely on your honesty? Can people depend on your fairness? Can people see compassion in your actions? These questions matter more than many realize. I have met individuals who possess very little material wealth, yet demonstrated extraordinary integrity. I have also met individuals who possessed enormous resources but lacked basic honesty. The difference was not education. The difference was not opportunity. The difference was character. Character determines how we use whatever position we have. A poor person can be honest. A wealthy person can be honest. A politician can be honest. A pastor can be honest. A business owner can be honest. A laboree can be honest. Integrity is not limited by circumstances. It is determined by choices. Unfortunately, many people prefer religious visibility to moral responsibility. Visibility is easier. It is easier to attend a public event than to admit wrongdoing. It is easier to quote a verse than to repay a debt honestly. It is easier to speak about kindness than to forgive someone who has hurt us. It is easier to criticize society than to improve our own behavior. That is why personal transformation requires effort. It requires humility. It requires self-awareness. It requires the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of the greatest mistakes people make is assuming that religious activity automatically produces moral growth. It does not. Growth requires intention. Growth requires reflection. Growth requires accountability. Growth requires action. Without those elements, a person can remain unchanged for decades while believing progress is occurring. That reality should concern all of us, because time alone does not create maturity. Experience alone does not create wisdom. Age alone does not create character. Deliberate choices create character, and those choices are made every day. Every interaction becomes an opportunity. Every conversation becomes an opportunity. Every business transaction becomes an opportunity. Every decision involving power becomes an opportunity. An opportunity either to live according to our values or to abandon them. The world today does not suffer from a shortage of religious language. There is no shortage of sermons. There is no shortage of speeches. There is no shortage of opinions. What the world often lacks is consistency. People are searching for examples they can trust. People are searching for leaders who practice what they preach. People are searching for evidence that integrity still exists. That search is understandable, because examples inspire more effectively than arguments. A single honest person can influence countless lives. A single act of integrity can restore trust. A single example of courage can inspire a community. That is why personal responsibility matters. Each of us contributes to the moral environment around us. Each of us influences others whether we realize it or not. Children watch parents. Employees watch employers. Citizens watch leaders. Congregations watch pastors. Students watch teachers. People learn from what they see, not merely from what they hear. If we truly believe something, eventually it should become visible in our actions. Otherwise, belief remains incomplete. I often think about how different our societies could become if more people focused on living their values rather than advertising them. Imagine communities where honesty became normal. Imagine workplaces where fairness became expected. Imagine governments where public service mattered more than personal gain. Imagine churches known primarily for compassion rather than wealth. Such change would not begin with new slogans. It would begin with individual decisions. It would begin when ordinary people choose integrity over convenience. That choice remains available to all of us, regardless of age, regardless of nationality, regardless of position, regardless of income. No one is excluded from the opportunity to live honestly. No one is excluded from the responsibility to treat others with dignity. No one is excluded from the obligation to practice what they claim to believe. That is why I believe this first habit deserves serious attention. Reading the Bible is valuable. Prayer is valuable. Worship is valuable. Faith is valuable. But none of these should become substitutes for ethical behavior. They should inspire ethical behavior. They should strengthen ethical behavior. They should guide ethical behavior. When they do, society benefits. When they do not, hypocrisy grows. And hypocrisy always carries consequences. This realization leads us naturally to another difficult question. What happens when religious influence becomes a source of personal wealth while ordinary people continue to suffer? What happens when spiritual leadership becomes disconnected from the needs of the vulnerable? What happens when those who speak most about faith appear to benefit the most from it financially? That is the next issue I want us to examine carefully, because the consequences reach millions of lives. The central message is simple. Faith is not proven by how often we read scripture. Faith is proven by how faithfully we live what we claim to believe. Words may inspire people for a moment, but character influences people for a lifetime. Religious leaders growing rich while their people suffer. After discussing the danger of reading scripture without practicing it, I want to address another issue that has troubled many people across Africa, America, and much of the world. This subject is uncomfortable. Some people avoid it completely. Others become defensive the moment it is mentioned. But if we are serious about truth, then we cannot ignore it. I want to speak about religious leaders who become wealthy while the people they serve continue to struggle. Let me begin by saying something important. Not every pastor is guilty of this. Not every minister is guilty of this. Not every church leader is guilty of this. Across the world, there are countless faithful servants who dedicate their lives to helping others. Many work long hours. Many live modestly. Many sacrifice personal comfort for the benefit of their communities. Many quietly support families in crisis. Many care for the elderly. Many help children receive education. Many provide hope to people experiencing deep suffering. Such leaders deserve respect. Their commitment deserves appreciation. Their example deserves recognition. But today I am speaking about something different. I am speaking about a growing culture in which religion becomes a pathway to personal enrichment rather than a calling to serve others. This phenomenon is not limited to one nation. It is not limited to one denomination. It appears wherever fame, money, and influence become more important than compassion. Over the years, I have watched reports from many countries. I have seen religious figures surrounded by extraordinary luxury, private aircraft, luxury vehicles, large estates, expensive jewelry, exclusive lifestyles. Meanwhile, many members of their congregations struggle to meet basic needs. When I see this contrast, I cannot help asking difficult questions. Why does a preacher need a private jet while families cannot afford medicine? Why does a religious leader require multiple luxury homes while children lack access to education? Why do some ministries accumulate enormous wealth while entire communities continue living without clean water? These questions are not expressions of envy. They are questions of responsibility. They are questions of priorities. They are questions of moral consistency. In the year 2026, development reports across Africa continue to highlight serious challenges. More than 280 million children still lacked adequate educational opportunities. More than 400 million people continued living without reliable access to clean drinking water. Millions of families face daily uncertainty regarding food security. Millions of young people struggle to find meaningful opportunities. These realities are not abstract statistics. They represent human beings. They represent parents. They represent children. They represent communities. They represent dreams delayed and opportunities denied. Whenever I think about these realities, I remember something simple. Leadership should always increase responsibility toward those who have less power. That principle applies to presidents. It applies to business executives. And it applies to religious leaders. The greater the influence, the greater the responsibility. The greater the resources, the greater the obligation to use them wisely. Unfortunately, some people reverse this principle. Instead of serving others through their influence, they use influence to serve themselves. Instead of viewing leadership as a responsibility, they view it as an opportunity for personal gain. This mindset creates enormous damage, because people naturally expect religious leaders to represent moral values. People expect them to embody compassion. People expect them to demonstrate humility. People expect them to prioritize service over status. When those expectations are repeatedly violated, trust begins to disappear. I have spoken with individuals who stopped attending church entirely because they became disillusioned. Not because they lost faith in God, not because they rejected Jesus, but because they became discouraged by what they observed. They saw wealth celebrated while poverty remained ignored. They saw success measured by possessions rather than character. They saw ministries focused on expansion while local communities remained neglected. Eventually, many began asking whether the institution still reflected the values it claimed to represent. This concern deserves serious attention, because faith should inspire hope. Faith should inspire generosity. Faith should inspire compassion. Faith should inspire sacrifice. If religious institutions lose sight of these priorities, something important has been lost. I often reflect on the image of Jesus presented throughout the Gospels. Whether someone is deeply religious or simply familiar with Christian teachings, one fact stands out clearly. Jesus consistently moved toward people who were suffering. He spent time with those who were marginalized. He paid attention to those society often ignored. He challenged arrogance. He challenged exploitation. He challenged hypocrisy. He challenged individuals who place status above humanity. That example remains powerful today, because it reminds us that authentic spiritual leadership is measured by service, not by luxury, not by fame, not by personal wealth. Service. The world already has many celebrities. The world already has many wealthy individuals. The world already has many people competing for attention. What the world desperately needs are more servants. People willing to place the needs of others ahead of personal ambition. People willing to use influence responsibly. People willing to sacrifice comfort for the benefit of their communities. That kind of leadership transforms lives. I have seen examples of it throughout Africa. I have met pastors who opened schools despite having limited resources. I have met ministers who organize food programs for struggling families. I have met faith leaders who help provide health care in underserved regions. I have met ordinary believers who quietly funded scholarships for children they would never meet. These examples inspire me when compassion takes priority over personal gain. The contrast between these leaders and those pursuing wealth for its own sake is impossible to ignore. One group asks, "How much can I accumulate?" The other asks, "How many lives can I improve?" Those questions produce very different outcomes. One creates admiration for wealth. The other creates hope. One strengthens personal status. The other strengthens communities. One focuses inward. The other focuses outward. History repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Societies become stronger when leaders embrace service. Societies become weaker when leaders embrace selfishness. This principle applies everywhere. It applies in government. It applies in business. It applies in religion. No institution is exempt. Whenever leaders begin viewing people primarily as sources of income, corruption follows. Whenever leaders forget the purpose of their influence, trust erodes. Whenever personal ambition becomes more important than human dignity, suffering increases. This is why accountability matters. No leader should be beyond questions. No institution should be beyond examination. No public figure should be immune from scrutiny. Accountability is not hostility. Accountability is protection. It protects communities. It protects institutions. It protects future generations. Most importantly, it protects truth. Some people fear accountability because they assume it creates division. In reality, the absence of accountability often creates greater damage. Problems hidden for years eventually become crises. Questions ignored for years eventually become scandals. Concerns dismissed for years eventually become public outrage. It is always wiser to confront issues honestly before they become destructive. That is why I believe believers should ask thoughtful questions. Where are resources being directed? Who benefits from financial decisions? How are vulnerable people being supported? What priorities receive the greatest attention? These are not rebellious questions. They are responsible questions. Responsible stewardship requires transparency. Responsible leadership welcomes accountability. Responsible institutions understand that trust must be earned continuously. I also want to speak directly to religious leaders who may hear these words. Leadership is a tremendous privilege. Few responsibilities carry greater influence. People often look to spiritual leaders during the most difficult moments of their lives. They seek guidance after personal loss. They seek comfort during suffering. They seek wisdom when facing uncertainty. Such trust is sacred. It should never be exploited. It should never become a tool for personal enrichment. It should never become an opportunity to manipulate vulnerable people. The responsibility is too important. The consequences are too significant. Future generations are watching. Young people are observing carefully. They notice where priorities lie. They notice what receives attention. They notice whether leaders genuinely care about people or merely care about appearances. And their conclusions will shape the future of faith communities for decades to come. That is why this issue matters far beyond finances. At its core, it is a question of values. What matters most? Status or service? Luxury or compassion? Recognition or responsibility? Possessions or people? Every leader answers these questions through actions. Not through speeches, not through public statements, through actions. I often wonder what many institutions would look like if every major decision began with a simple question. How will this help those who are struggling most? Imagine how different priorities might become. Imagine how many communities could be transformed. Imagine how many children could receive opportunities. Imagine how many families could find hope. Sometimes, extraordinary change begins with a single shift in perspective. From self-interest to service, from accumulation to generosity, from prestige to purpose. That shift has the power to reshape entire societies. As I continued reflecting on these issues, another concern emerged. Not all misuse of faith occurs within religious institutions. Some of the most damaging examples appear within political systems. There are leaders who stand before cameras and speak about God. There are leaders who quote scripture during speeches. There are leaders who publicly emphasize their religious beliefs, yet behind closed doors they engage in corruption, dishonesty, and exploitation. This pattern may be even more dangerous because it affects entire nations, and that is the next issue we must confront honestly. The central message is simple. Spiritual leadership should never become a pathway to luxury built upon the struggles of ordinary people. True leadership is measured not by what a person possesses, but by how faithfully that person serves those who need help the most. Political leaders who use faith to hide corruption, After speaking about religious leaders, I must now address a subject that strikes even closer to my own responsibilities. Because I am not only speaking as a citizen, I am speaking as a president. I understand the weight of public office. I understand the influence that political leaders possess. I understand how easily power can be abused when accountability disappears. That is why I believe this conversation cannot stop at churches, ministries, or religious institutions. It must also include governments. It must include presidents. It must include ministers. It must include lawmakers. It must include every public official entrusted with authority. Throughout history, many political leaders have understood something important. People are more likely to trust someone who appears moral. People are more likely to support someone who appears faithful. People are more likely to follow someone who speaks the language of shared values. There is nothing wrong with this when the faith is genuine. There is nothing wrong with leaders speaking openly about their beliefs. There is nothing wrong with prayer. There is nothing wrong with quoting scripture. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging God. The problem begins when faith becomes a political costume rather than a personal conviction. The problem begins when religious language is used to hide unethical behavior. The problem begins when public displays of devotion become tools of manipulation. Unfortunately, this has happened many times, and it continues to happen today. We have all seen it. A politician stands before cameras and speaks passionately about morality. A politician quotes verses from scripture. A politician attends public worship services. A politician speaks about justice and righteousness. The speeches sound inspiring. The words sound convincing. The presentation appears sincere. But behind the scenes, something entirely different may be taking place. Public funds disappear. Government contracts are manipulated. National resources are sold for private benefit. Families connected to power become extraordinarily wealthy. Citizens continue struggling while a small group prospers. The contrast becomes impossible to ignore. At that point, a difficult question emerges. What value do religious words have when they are not supported by ethical actions? This question is not directed at one country. It is not directed at one political system. It is not directed at one continent. It is a question for humanity. Because corruption exists in many forms and in many places, it wears different faces. It speaks different languages. But its consequences are remarkably similar. Corruption steals opportunities. Corruption weakens institutions. Corruption destroys trust. Corruption delays development. Corruption creates suffering for people who have done nothing wrong. When leaders misuse public resources, the damage extends far beyond financial loss. Schools remain unfinished. Hospitals remain underfunded. Roads remain inadequate. Communities remain underserved. Children lose opportunities. Families lose hope. Entire generations pay the price. That is why corruption is not merely an economic issue. It is a moral issue. It is a human issue. It is an issue of justice. I have often reflected on how differently societies function when leaders view public office as a responsibility rather than an entitlement. The difference is profound. One leader asks, "What can this position give me?" Another asks, "What can I give through this position?" One leader focuses on personal gain. Another focuses on public service. One leader treats power as ownership. Another treats power as stewardship. The outcomes are completely different. The first approach enriches a few. The second benefits many. The first creates resentment. The second builds trust. The first weakens institutions. The second strengthens them. Unfortunately, some leaders attempt to conceal selfish behavior behind religious imagery. They understand that faith carries emotional influence. They understand that religious symbolism can inspire loyalty. They understand that many citizens want leaders who appear principled. So they create a public image designed to attract trust. Yet image and integrity are not the same thing. A carefully managed reputation is not the same thing as character. A powerful speech is not the same thing as honesty. A public prayer is not the same thing as justice. These distinctions matter because societies often suffer when appearance becomes more important than substance. I remember conversations with ordinary citizens from various countries who expressed similar frustrations. Many said they were tired of promises. Many said they were tired of speeches. Many said they were tired of hearing leaders talk about values while acting differently. Their frustration was understandable. Trust cannot survive indefinitely without evidence. Eventually, people begin evaluating actions rather than words. And actions reveal priorities. If a leader claims to care about citizens but consistently benefits personal associates, priorities become clear. If a leader claims to value transparency but avoids accountability, priorities become clear. If a leader claims to serve the nation while enriching personal interests, priorities become clear. Words may delay judgment. Actions eventually determine it. This principle applies to me as well. In fact, it applies especially to me, because leadership begins with personal responsibility. Whenever I speak about corruption, I must first recognize my own obligation. Whenever I speak about accountability, I must accept accountability myself. Whenever I speak about service, I must ask whether I am truly serving. No leader should place himself above examination. No leader should assume that good intentions alone are sufficient. Power has a way of testing people. It reveals weaknesses. It reveals motivations. It reveals character. Many individuals appear humble until they acquire authority. Many individuals appear ethical until they encounter temptation. Many individuals appear committed to service until personal interests are threatened. That is why leadership requires constant self-reflection. The greatest danger is not always external opposition. Sometimes the greatest danger is believing that power exempts us from moral standards. History repeatedly demonstrates the consequences of that mistake. Empires have fallen because leaders became disconnected from the people they governed. Governments have collapsed because corruption became normalized. Nations have experienced instability because public trust eroded beyond repair. The pattern is familiar. When leaders prioritize themselves over the public good, decline eventually follows. The timeline may vary. The circumstances may differ. But the outcome remains remarkably consistent. Trust disappears. Institutions weaken. Citizens become cynical. Social unity deteriorates. This is why ethical leadership matters so much. It affects every aspect of national life. Economic growth depends on trust. Investment depends on trust. Community cooperation depends on trust. Democratic systems depend on trust. Even social stability depends on trust. When corruption spreads, trust declines. When trust declines, progress becomes more difficult. That reality should concern every leader regardless of political ideology. The issue is not whether someone identifies as conservative or progressive. The issue is not whether someone belongs to one political party or another. The issue is integrity. Without integrity, every system eventually struggles. With integrity, even difficult challenges become more manageable. I often think about the expectations citizens place upon leaders. Most people do not expect perfection. They understand that leaders are human. They understand that mistakes occur. What citizens often seek is honesty. They seek sincerity. They seek accountability. They seek evidence that leaders genuinely care about the people they represent. These expectations are reasonable. Leadership should never be viewed as a privilege disconnected from responsibility. Leadership should be viewed as service. The higher the office, the greater the responsibility. The greater the authority, the greater the obligation. This principle remains true whether one leads a village, a city, a ministry, or an entire nation. No position changes that reality. I believe many of the world's problems would become easier to solve if more leaders embraced this perspective. Imagine political systems where personal enrichment was rejected. Imagine governments where public resources were treated as sacred responsibilities. Imagine leaders who measured success by improvements in citizens' lives rather than personal wealth. Imagine national policies shaped by long-term public benefit rather than short-term political advantage. Such leadership would inspire confidence. Such leadership would encourage unity. Such leadership would strengthen institutions. Most importantly, such leadership would honor the trust placed in public office. The tragedy is that corruption often disguises itself as normal behavior. People become accustomed to it. People begin expecting it. People begin assuming that dishonesty is inevitable. That assumption is dangerous, because what becomes accepted eventually becomes repeated. If corruption is viewed as unavoidable, efforts to resist it weaken. If dishonesty is viewed as normal, integrity becomes rare. If selfishness is viewed as practical, service becomes exceptional. Societies cannot thrive under those conditions. That is why moral courage matters. Citizens need courage. Leaders need courage. Institutions need courage. The courage to reject practices that undermine public trust. The courage to choose transparency when secrecy would be easier. The courage to place principle above convenience. These choices are never easy, but they are necessary, especially for those entrusted with authority. As I continued thinking about these issues, I realized something important. The consequences of hypocrisy, corruption, and selfish leadership do not remain isolated. Eventually, they affect entire societies. They shape the future. They influence generations. They create patterns that can last for decades. That leads directly to the next question. What price are we already paying for these behaviors? What consequences are visible today? And what consequences may await future generations if nothing changes? Those are the questions we must confront next. Because every action produces results. Every decision creates consequences. And societies, like individuals, eventually live with the outcomes of their choices. The central message is simple. God does not need beautiful political speeches. God does not need carefully crafted public images. God does not need leaders who speak about morality while practicing corruption. What matters is integrity. What matters is justice. What matters is using authority to serve rather than exploit. Because leadership is not measured by power. Leadership is measured by responsibility. The consequences we are paying for today and the future we risk creating. After examining hypocrisy among individuals, religious leaders, and political leaders, we arrive at a question that cannot be avoided. What happens when these behaviors continue for years? What happens when dishonesty becomes common? What happens when greed is rewarded? What happens when corruption becomes normal? What happens when people repeatedly say one thing and do another? The answer is simple. Societies begin paying a price. Sometimes that price appears immediately. Sometimes it takes years to become visible. But eventually the consequences arrive. No nation is exempt. No community is exempt. No institution is exempt. Human beings often believe they can escape the consequences of their actions. History repeatedly proves otherwise. When I study the rise and fall of civilizations, I notice a pattern that appears again and again. Many great societies did not collapse because they lacked intelligence. Many did not collapse because they lacked resources. Many did not collapse because they lacked talent. Instead, they weakened from within. Greed replaced responsibility. Power replaced service. Self-interest replaced common purpose. Trust began disappearing. Eventually, the foundations became too weak to support the structures built upon them. The decline was often gradual. People rarely recognized it while it was happening. That is what makes this lesson so important. Most societal decline does not begin with dramatic events. It begins with small compromises repeated over time. A dishonest transaction here, a hidden act of corruption there, a lie that seems harmless, a decision motivated by greed, a refusal to accept responsibility. Individually, each action appears insignificant. Collectively, they reshape entire societies. This reality concerns me deeply when I look at the world in 2026. Across many regions, we see warning signs. Wars continue destroying lives. Economic uncertainty affects millions of families. Public debt burdens many nations. Social division appears to be increasing. Trust in institutions continues declining. Many citizens no longer believe leaders are telling the truth. Many communities feel disconnected from one another. Many young people feel uncertain about the future. These challenges are not caused by a single factor. They are complex. They involve economics. They involve politics. They involve technology. They involve history. But moral decline often intensifies every other problem. When trust disappears, cooperation becomes difficult. When honesty disappears, progress slows. When responsibility disappears, systems become fragile. This connection is often overlooked. People focus on visible crises while ignoring the deeper causes beneath them. Imagine a building with cracks appearing throughout its foundation. Painting the walls may improve appearances. Decorating the rooms may create temporary comfort. But unless the foundation is repaired, the structure remains vulnerable. The same principle applies to societies. Economic reforms matter. Political reforms matter. Technological innovation matters. But character also matters. Without integrity, even the best systems eventually struggle. Without honesty, policies become less effective. Without accountability, institutions weaken. Without trust, cooperation becomes increasingly difficult. That is why I believe we must discuss consequences openly. Not to create fear, not to create pessimism, but to encourage awareness. Awareness is the first step toward change. One consequence already visible in many places is growing cynicism. More people are beginning to believe that integrity no longer matters. More people are beginning to assume that dishonesty is necessary for success. More people are beginning to expect corruption rather than reject it. This mindset is dangerous because expectations influence behavior. When people expect dishonesty, they become more likely to participate in it. When people expect selfishness, they become less willing to sacrifice for others. When people expect betrayal, trust becomes harder to build. Over time, society begins adapting to dysfunction instead of correcting it. That adaptation creates long-term damage. I worry especially about the impact on younger generations. Young people are watching everything. They observe leaders. They observe institutions. They observe families. They observe communities. And they learn from what they see. If they repeatedly witness hypocrisy, what lesson will they learn? If they repeatedly witness corruption, what lesson will they learn? If they repeatedly witness greed, rewarded, and integrity ignored, what lesson will they learn? The answer should concern all of us. Many may begin believing that values are merely slogans. Many may conclude that honesty is naive. Many may decide that ethics are obstacles rather than principles. Such conclusions create a dangerous future, because societies depend upon more than laws. They depend upon shared values. They depend upon mutual trust. They depend upon citizens who believe that doing the right thing still matters. Without these foundations, division grows, and division carries its own consequences. Today we see increasing polarization in many parts of the world. People no longer simply disagree. They often distrust one another completely. Conversations become conflicts. Differences become hostility. Cooperation becomes rare. This environment benefits no one. Communities become weaker. Nations become less stable. Solutions become harder to achieve. Trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. That is why protecting it is so important. Another consequence is the loss of hope. Hope is one of humanity's most valuable resources. People can endure remarkable hardships when they believe improvement is possible. People can overcome extraordinary challenges when they believe their efforts matter. But hope requires credibility. Hope requires evidence that integrity still exists. Hope requires examples worth following. When hypocrisy becomes widespread, hope begins eroding. People stop believing change is possible. People stop believing institutions can improve. People stop believing leaders can be trusted. This emotional decline often becomes as damaging as economic decline, because hopeless societies struggle to move forward. Hopeless communities struggle to unite. Hopeless individuals struggle to persevere. That is why moral leadership remains essential. Not because leaders are perfect, but because examples matter. One honest leader can inspire thousands. One ethical institution can restore confidence. One courageous decision can encourage others to act similarly. Positive influence spreads just as powerfully as negative influence, sometimes even more powerfully. I have witnessed this throughout my life. I have seen communities transform because a few individuals chose integrity. I have seen organizations improve because a handful of people insisted on accountability. I have seen young people inspired by examples of courage and service. These experiences remind me that decline is not inevitable. The future is not fixed. The outcome depends on choices. That truth gives me hope. Because if human choices contribute to problems, human choices can also contribute to solutions. However, solutions require honesty. We must first acknowledge where current paths are leading. If corruption continues unchecked, future generations will inherit weaker institutions. If greed continues dominating decision-making, inequality will deepen. If hypocrisy continues spreading, public trust will decline further. If selfishness continues replacing service, social unity will deteriorate. These outcomes are not predictions of destiny. They are warnings about direction. Direction matters. A society moving toward greater integrity produces different results than a society moving toward greater corruption. A society moving toward compassion produces different results than a society moving toward indifference. A society moving toward responsibility produces different results than a society moving toward selfishness. Every generation helps determine which direction will prevail. That responsibility belongs to all of us, not only leaders, not only governments, not only institutions, all of us. Because societal culture is shaped by millions of individual decisions. How we treat neighbors, how we conduct business, how we use influence, how we respond to temptation, how we handle responsibility. These choices accumulate over time. They create patterns. Those patterns create cultures. Those cultures shape futures. This is why personal integrity remains so important. It may seem insignificant. One honest act, one ethical decision, one moment of courage. Yet these actions influence others. Others observe them. Others learn from them. Others repeat them. Positive examples spread. Negative examples spread as well. The question is which influence will become stronger? I believe we are living during a period when this question matters enormously. The world possesses incredible technological capabilities. The world possesses extraordinary knowledge. The world possesses unprecedented connectivity. Yet none of these achievements automatically produce wisdom. None automatically produce compassion. None automatically produce justice. Character remains essential. Without character, progress becomes unstable. Without character, power becomes dangerous. Without character, prosperity becomes vulnerable. History confirms this repeatedly, and history deserves our attention. Not because we should fear the future, but because we should learn from the past. Every civilization leaves lessons behind. Some teach us what to emulate, others teach us what to avoid. The wisest societies learn from both. As I reflected upon these consequences, I found myself returning to a deeper question. If hypocrisy, corruption, greed, and selfishness lead to such outcomes, then what exactly does genuine faith require? What values should guide us? What qualities should we pursue? What kind of people should we strive to become? These questions bring us to the heart of the matter. Because criticizing harmful behavior is not enough. We must also understand the alternative. We must understand the principles capable of building stronger communities, stronger nations, and stronger lives. That is what I want to discuss next. The central message is simple. The consequences of hypocrisy and corruption are already visible around us. They weaken trust. They weaken communities. They weaken hope. If we continue down the same path, future generations will pay an even greater price. But if we choose integrity, responsibility, and compassion, a different future remains possible. And that future begins with understanding what Jesus truly wanted from those who claim to follow him. What Jesus truly wants from us. After speaking about hypocrisy, corruption, greed, and the consequences they create, I believe we must now turn our attention to a more important question. If these behaviors are not what Jesus intended, then what did he actually want from us? This question matters because criticism alone cannot transform lives. Pointing out problems is necessary. But eventually we must move beyond identifying what is wrong and begin understanding what is right. We must ask ourselves what kind of people we are meant to become. We must ask what values deserve our loyalty. We must ask what principles can guide us through a world that often rewards the opposite. As I have reflected on this throughout the years, I have reached a simple conclusion. I do not believe Jesus came to create a competition for status. I do not believe he came to help people appear superior to one another. I do not believe he came to build systems based on pride, arrogance, or self-promotion. Instead, I believe his message consistently pointed toward something deeper, something more demanding, something more transformative: honesty, humility, justice, compassion, service. These values appear again and again whenever people discuss the life and teachings of Jesus. Not fame, not wealth, not influence for its own sake, not public recognition. The more I observe the world, the more convinced I become that many people have confused religious visibility with spiritual maturity. The two are not the same. A person may be widely known and still lack character. A person may possess influence and still lack integrity. A person may appear religious and still lack compassion. At the same time, someone living quietly may demonstrate extraordinary moral strength. Someone unknown to the public may positively influence countless lives. Someone with very little power may embody values that transform an entire community. That is why appearances can be misleading. Character reveals far more than reputation. I sometimes wonder how differently people would evaluate success if character became the primary measurement. Imagine asking different questions. Not how much money has this person accumulated, but how many lives has this person improved? Not how famous has this person become, but how trustworthy is this person? Not how many followers does this person have, but how does this person treat others? These questions point toward something deeper. They point toward values. And values ultimately shape destinies. Individuals are shaped by values. Families are shaped by values. Communities are shaped by values. Nations are shaped by values. The challenge is that values are often tested during difficult circumstances. It is easy to speak about honesty when lying would provide no advantage. It is easy to speak about humility when success has not yet arrived. It is easy to speak about compassion when sacrifice is not required. The true test comes when principles become costly. The true test comes when integrity demands something from us. That is when character reveals itself. I believe this is one reason humility remains so important. Humility is often misunderstood. Humility means weakness. Others think humility means lacking confidence. I disagree. True humility requires strength. It requires the ability to acknowledge limitations. It requires the courage to admit mistakes. It requires the wisdom to recognize that no individual possesses all the answers. Without humility, learning becomes difficult. Without humility, accountability becomes threatening. Without humility, growth becomes limited. Pride creates barriers. Humility creates opportunities. The same principle applies to honesty. Many people appreciate honesty from others. Far fewer appreciate honesty about themselves. Yet personal honesty is essential. How can we improve if we refuse to acknowledge our weaknesses? How can we correct mistakes if we deny they exist? How can we grow if we continually justify every decision? Self-deception prevents progress. Truth creates the possibility of change. That is why honesty remains one of the most powerful virtues. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. Justice is another value that deserves attention. Too often people view justice as something abstract, something connected only to courts, laws, or governments. In reality, justice begins much closer to home. Justice influences how employers treat workers. Justice influences how leaders treat citizens. Justice influences how resources are distributed. Justice influences how opportunities are created. Justice influences how vulnerable people are protected. Whenever fairness disappears, injustice grows. Whenever injustice grows, suffering follows. That relationship is unavoidable. No society can escape it. This is why justice cannot remain merely an idea. It must become a practice. It must influence decisions. It must influence priorities. It must influence behavior. Otherwise, it remains little more than a slogan. Compassion is equally important, perhaps more important than many realize. We live in a world where millions of people carry invisible burdens. Some struggle financially. Some struggle emotionally. Some struggle physically. Some struggle spiritually. Many suffer quietly. Many suffer alone. Compassion allows us to recognize this reality. Compassion reminds us that every person carries a story. Every person faces challenges. Every person possesses dignity. Without compassion, society becomes cold. Without compassion, power becomes dangerous. Without compassion, success becomes self-centered. Compassion helps human beings remember one another. Compassion strengthens communities. Compassion creates hope. And hope remains essential. Finally, there is service. This may be the value that challenges modern culture most directly. Because much of the world encourages people to ask what they can gain. Service asks what we can give. The world often encourages self-promotion. Service encourage contribution. The world often rewards visibility. Service often occurs quietly. Yet service possesses extraordinary power. A teacher serves students. A nurse serves patients. A parent serves children. A community leader serves neighbors. A public official should serve citizens. A religious leader should serve congregants. Every meaningful position carries an opportunity to serve. When people embrace this mindset, communities become stronger. Relationships become healthier. Trust becomes easier to build. I believe these values, honesty, humility, justice, compassion, and service, capture something essential. Not merely about religion, but about humanity. They help explain why some individuals leave lasting positive legacies while others leave disappointment behind. They help explain why some leaders inspire trust while others inspire suspicion. They help explain why some communities thrive while others struggle. Values matter. Character matters. Choices matter. One of the most important realizations I have reached is this. A person can possess extensive religious knowledge and still remain far from the values they claim to admire. A person can memorize scripture and still lack compassion. A person can attend religious services faithfully and still behave unjustly. A person can quote sacred texts and still mistreat others. Knowledge alone does not guarantee transformation. That reality should humble all of us, including me, because it reminds us that spiritual growth is not measured by information. It is measured by application, not by what we know, but by what we become. I have often reflected on how easy it is to judge others. Human beings seem naturally drawn toward criticism. We notice flaws quickly. We notice mistakes quickly. We notice failures quickly. Yet self-examination requires greater effort. It requires greater honesty. It requires greater courage. Perhaps this is why genuine growth begins internally. Before changing society, we must examine ourselves. Before correcting others, we must evaluate our own conduct. Before demanding accountability, we must accept accountability. This principle remains relevant regardless of age, nationality, profession, or social status. Everyone benefits from self-reflection. Everyone benefits from humility. Everyone benefits from striving toward higher standards. No one graduates from the responsibility of personal growth. I certainly have not. There are moments when I ask myself difficult questions. Have I listened carefully enough? Have I acted fairly enough? Have I allowed pride to influence decisions? Have I remained faithful to the responsibilities entrusted to me? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of awareness. Every leader should ask them. Every citizen should ask them. Every believer should ask them. Because growth begins when honesty replaces excuses. The more I think about it, the more convinced I become that the world does not primarily suffer from a lack of information. Information is everywhere. Knowledge is accessible. Opinions are abundant. What the world often lacks is application. The consistent practice of values, the daily commitment to integrity, the willingness to live according to principles, even when doing so becomes inconvenient. That is where transformation occurs. Not during public performances, not during carefully prepared speeches, but during ordinary decisions made every day. That is where character is formed. That is where trust is built. That is where faith becomes visible. And perhaps that is what matters most. Not what we claim, not what we display, not what we advertise, but what we consistently practice. Because practice reveals priorities. Practice reveals values. Practice reveals character. And character ultimately shapes legacy. As I reflected upon these truths, I realized something else. It is easy to speak about what others should do. It is much harder to examine ourselves honestly. Before asking anyone else to change, I must first acknowledge my own responsibility. I must acknowledge my own imperfections. I must acknowledge my own need for self-examination. That realization leads directly to the next part of this message. Because I do not stand before anyone as a perfect man. I stand as someone who must ask himself difficult questions every single day. The central message is simple. Jesus did not call people toward fame, power, arrogance, or religious performance. He called people toward honesty, humility, justice, compassion, and service. And a person may know every verse in Scripture yet still remain far from these values. True faith is not measured by what we memorize. True faith is measured by what we become. I must examine myself too. After everything I have said so far, I feel it is important to stop for a moment and speak about myself. Because whenever we discuss hypocrisy, corruption, integrity, or faith, there is always a danger. The danger is that people begin thinking only about someone else. They think about politicians. They think about pastors. They think about wealthy individuals. They think about public figures. They think about people whose failures are visible. But true reflection begins much closer to home. It begins with ourselves. That includes me. I do not stand before you as a perfect man. I do not stand before you as someone who has never made mistakes. I do not stand before you as someone who has mastered every lesson I have discussed. I stand before you as a human being. A leader, yes. A president, yes. But still a human being. And because I am human, I must constantly examine myself. I must ask difficult questions. I must challenge my own assumptions. I must remain willing to confront uncomfortable truths. Otherwise, I risk becoming the very thing I am warning others about. Power has a unique effect on people. It can create confidence. It can create opportunities. It can create influence. But it can also create blind spots. The longer a person remains in a position of authority, the greater the temptation to believe that criticism no longer applies. The greater the temptation to believe that one's intentions automatically justify one's actions. The greater the temptation to assume that personal judgment is always correct. That temptation is dangerous. History is filled with examples of leaders who stopped questioning themselves. Many began with good intentions. Many genuinely wanted to help. Many believed they were serving noble causes. But over time, self-examination disappeared. Humility disappeared. Accountability disappeared. Eventually, mistakes multiplied. Not because those leaders lacked intelligence, but because they stopped listening. They stopped learning. They stopped questioning themselves. I never want to reach that point. That is why I ask myself questions regularly. Not because someone forces me to do so, but because leadership requires it. One of the first questions I ask is simple. Am I truly serving the people? This question sounds obvious, yet it is more difficult than many realize. Every leader speaks about serving. Every leader promises service. Every leader understands the language of public responsibility. But genuine service is not measured by speeches. It is measured by outcomes. It is measured by priorities. It is measured by decisions. A leader can spend hours talking about the people while focusing primarily on personal interests. Words alone prove nothing. Actions reveal the truth. That is why I continually return to this question. Am I serving the people? Or am I serving myself? The answer must never be assumed. It must be examined. Another question I ask myself is equally important. Am I living according to what I say? This question applies to everyone. Not only leaders, not only religious figures, everyone. It is easy to speak about integrity. It is harder to practice integrity consistently. It is easy to encourage sacrifice. It is harder to make sacrifices personally. It is easy to promote accountability. It is harder to accept accountability ourselves. These realities remind me that credibility depends upon consistency. People do not merely listen to leaders. They observe them. They evaluate whether actions match words. They notice contradictions. They notice patterns. And they draw conclusions accordingly. That is why alignment between words and actions matters so much. Without it, trust weakens. With it, trust grows. A third question remains especially important to me. Am I placing the interest of my nation above my personal interests? This question may be one of the most important responsibilities any public servant can face, because power always presents opportunities. Some opportunities benefit society, others benefit the individual holding authority. The challenge is recognizing the difference. The challenge is choosing correctly. Every generation produces leaders who face this test. Some pass, some fail. The difference often comes down to values. When personal ambition becomes stronger than public responsibility, corruption becomes possible. When public responsibility remains stronger than personal ambition, integrity becomes possible. This principle is simple, yet it requires constant vigilance. No one becomes immune to temptation. No one becomes immune to pride. No one becomes immune to selfishness. That includes presidents. That includes ministers. That includes religious leaders. That includes business executives. That includes ordinary citizens. Human nature affects all of us. That is why self-awareness remains essential. One of the greatest mistakes a person can make is believing that personal growth is no longer necessary. The moment we stop learning, we begin declining. The moment we stop reflecting, we become vulnerable. The moment we stop questioning ourselves, blind spots expand. This applies regardless of age. It applies regardless of success. It applies regardless of experience. The need for self-examination never disappears. In fact, it often becomes more important as responsibility increases. I have learned that leadership is not primarily about controlling others. It is first about controlling oneself. Managing emotions, managing ego, managing impulses, managing priorities. Without self-discipline, external leadership becomes difficult. Without internal accountability, public accountability loses credibility. This lesson extends far beyond politics. Parents face similar challenges. Teachers face similar challenges. Community leaders face similar challenges. Religious leaders face similar challenges. Every person who influences others carries responsibility. And responsibility begins internally. That is why I believe meaningful change cannot be imposed entirely from above. Laws matter. Policies matter. Institutions matter. But lasting transformation also requires personal commitment. Every person must decide what kind of character they wish to develop. Every person must decide what values they wish to prioritize. Every person must decide whether honesty, humility, compassion, and integrity will remain important. No government can make those decisions on behalf of citizens. No church can make those decisions on behalf of congregants. No leader can make those decisions on behalf of followers. Each individual must choose. That realization gives me both concern and hope. Concern because change requires effort. Hope because change remains possible. Every day provides opportunities for improvement. Every day provides opportunities to correct mistakes. Every day provides opportunities to grow. That opportunity belongs to all of us, including me. I sometimes think about how different public life would become if more leaders openly acknowledged their imperfections, not as a public relations strategy, not as a performance, but as a sincere recognition of reality. Human beings are imperfect. Leadership does not change that fact. Titles do not change that fact. Positions do not change that fact. Recognizing our limitations often strengthens judgment. It encourages caution. It encourages listening. It encourages learning. Humility protects people from many mistakes. Pride often leads directly toward them. That is why I value honest feedback. Not because criticism is always pleasant. It rarely is. But because constructive criticism can reveal things we fail to see ourselves. No person possesses a complete perspective. No leader sees everything. No individual understands every consequence. Listening helps close those gaps. Listening creates opportunities for improvement. Listening demonstrates respect. Perhaps that is one reason why humility remains such an important virtue. Humility allows growth. Pride resists it. Humility invites learning. Pride discourages it. Humility strengthens relationships. Pride often damages them. The more responsibility a person carries, the more valuable humility becomes. As I reflect on these lessons, one conclusion becomes clear. The change we hope to see in society must begin somewhere. Many people wait for governments to change first. Others wait for institutions to change first. Others wait for leaders to change first. But lasting transformation often begins at the individual level. It begins when one person chooses honesty. It begins when one person chooses integrity. It begins when one person chooses responsibility. It begins when one person decides to live according to values rather than convenience. Those choices may appear small. In reality, they are powerful. Because influence spreads. Character spreads. Examples spread. A single individual can inspire family members. A family can influence a community. A community can influence a nation. A nation can influence the world. The process often begins quietly, but it begins somewhere. That is why self-examination matters so much. Not because it produces perfection. Perfection is not the goal. Growth is the goal. Awareness is the goal. Improvement is the goal. Every honest question we ask ourselves creates an opportunity to become better. Every moment of reflection creates an opportunity to adjust direction. Every act of humility creates an opportunity to learn. I believe that principle applies to everyone listening today. Regardless of where you live, regardless of your occupation, regardless of your beliefs, regardless of your circumstances, the future is shaped by countless individual decisions, and those decisions are influenced by character. That is why character deserves attention, not only in leaders, in all of us. As I continued reflecting on this, another thought emerged. Many people ask what practical steps they should take. They understand the problems. They understand the importance of integrity. They understand the need for change. But they wonder where to begin. The answer may be simpler than many expect. Transformation does not always begin with dramatic actions. Often, it begins with small choices practiced consistently. There are 3 actions I believe every Christian and perhaps every person can begin immediately. They are simple, they are practical, and they have the power to change both individuals and communities. That is what I want to discuss next. The central message is simple. I am not exempt from the standards I discuss. I must examine myself continually. I must ask whether I am serving others honestly. I must ask whether my actions match my words. I must ask whether I place public responsibility above personal interest. Because lasting change begins when each of us accepts responsibility for our own character before demanding change from others. 3 things every Christian should do starting today. After everything we have discussed, some people may be asking a practical question. What should I do now? That question matters. Because understanding a problem is only the beginning. Awareness is valuable. Reflection is valuable. Conversation is valuable. But eventually, action becomes necessary. Without action, even the best ideas remain unfinished. Without action, good intentions produce little change. Without action, the future looks very similar to the past. That is why I want to share 3 simple practices. These are not complicated strategies. They do not require wealth. They do not require special influence. They do not require political power. Almost anyone can begin today. And although I am addressing Christians specifically, I believe these principles can benefit people from many different backgrounds. The first practice is simple. Stop judging others so quickly. This may sound easy. In reality, it is surprisingly difficult. Human beings often notice the faults of others before recognizing their own. We identify mistakes quickly. We criticize weaknesses quickly. We form conclusions quickly. Sometimes we know very little about a person's circumstances, yet we become confident in our judgments. This habit creates division. It creates resentment. It creates misunderstanding. Most importantly, it distracts us from examining ourselves. I have noticed something interesting throughout my life. The people most focused on personal growth often spend less time condemning others. They are too busy working on their own character. They are too busy improving their own conduct. They understand that self-improvement requires effort. And because they understand their own imperfections, they often become more patient with the imperfections of others. This does not mean ignoring wrongdoing. It does not mean abandoning standards. It does not mean pretending that harmful behavior is acceptable. Accountability remains important. Truth remains important. Justice remains important. But there is a difference between accountability and constant judgment. One seeks improvement. The other often seeks superiority. That distinction matters. Every person listening today has faced struggles unknown to others. Every person has experienced failures. Every person has needed forgiveness at some point. Remembering this reality often creates humility. And humility changes how we treat people. The second practice is equally important. Help at least one person who is struggling. Notice that I did not say help everyone. No individual can solve every problem. No individual can eliminate all suffering. No individual possesses unlimited resources. But every person can help someone. That possibility exists almost everywhere. Perhaps it is a neighbor experiencing hardship. Perhaps it is a family member facing difficulties. Perhaps it is an elderly person who feels forgotten. Perhaps it is a child who needs encouragement. Perhaps it is a stranger facing a difficult season. The specific situation matters less than the principle. Choose someone. Help someone. Make a positive difference in one life. We often underestimate the impact of small acts of kindness. A conversation can restore hope. A meal can relieve stress. A word of encouragement can strengthen perseverance. A simple gesture can remind someone that they are not alone. Human beings need one another. This truth becomes obvious during difficult times. Communities become stronger when people support one another. Families become stronger when people support one another. Nations become stronger when people support one another. Compassion creates connections. Those connections create resilience. And resilience helps societies endure challenges. I sometimes think that many of the world's problems appear overwhelming because people focus only on what they cannot do. They see enormous challenges. They see poverty. They see conflict. They see injustice. Then they conclude that their individual actions cannot matter. But history tells a different story. Many significant changes began with ordinary individuals making small choices. One act of courage, one act of generosity, one act of integrity, one act of service. Positive influence often spreads further than expected. You may never fully know how your actions affect others, yet that does not reduce their importance. The third practice may be the most important of all. Live according to what you claim to believe. This sounds simple. It is not. In many ways, it is one of the greatest challenges a person can face. Because beliefs become meaningful only when they influence behavior. Anyone can describe values. Anyone can discuss principles. Anyone can express opinions. The true test is application. What happens when honesty becomes costly? What happens when integrity creates inconvenience? What happens when compassion requires sacrifice? What happens when doing the right thing becomes difficult? Those moments reveal whether beliefs are genuine. Character is built through consistency, not through occasional acts, not through temporary enthusiasm. Consistency, day after day, decision after decision, choice after choice. That is how trust is established. That is how respect is earned. That is how influence grows. People pay attention to consistency, far more than many realize. Children notice consistency. Employees notice consistency. Citizens notice consistency. Congregations notice consistency. Friends notice consistency. Family members notice consistency. Eventually they begin believing what they observe, not what they are told. What they observe. This is why examples matter so much. The world does not primarily need more speeches. The world does not primarily need more arguments. The world does not primarily need more public declarations. The world needs more examples. Examples of honesty. Examples of humility. Examples of compassion. examples of courage, examples of service. A good example possesses extraordinary power. One person living with integrity can influence countless others. One family committed to strong values can inspire a neighborhood. One community committed to helping others can transform lives. The effect spreads, not always immediately, not always dramatically, but consistently. That is how meaningful change often occurs. Quietly, steadily, through example. I remember meeting people throughout my life who influenced me not because of their status, but because of their character. Some were leaders, some were not. Some possessed wealth, some did not. What made them memorable was not their position. It was their consistency. Their actions matched their principles. Their conduct reflected their values. Their lives demonstrated sincerity. That authenticity created influence. People trusted them. People respected them. People learned from them, not because they demanded attention, because they earned credibility. I believe credibility remains one of the most valuable forms of influence available to any person. Money cannot purchase it. Titles cannot guarantee it. Public recognition cannot create it. Credibility is earned, slowly, patiently, through repeated acts of integrity. This truth should encourage us, because it means meaningful influence is available to everyone, not only famous people, not only wealthy people, not only leaders. Everyone, every parent possesses influence. Every teacher possesses influence. Every worker possesses influence. Every neighbor possesses influence. Every citizen possesses influence. The question is how that influence will be used. Will it encourage honesty or dishonesty? Will it encourage compassion or indifference? Will it encourage responsibility or selfishness? Each person answers these questions through daily choices. That is why these three practices matter. Stop judging others so quickly. Help at least one person who is struggling. Live according to what you claim to believe. None of these actions require extraordinary resources, yet together they possess remarkable power, because they address some of the deepest problems we have discussed. Judgment creates division. Humility creates understanding. Indifference creates suffering. Compassion creates hope. Hypocrisy destroys trust. Integrity restores trust. The solutions may not always be complicated. Often they begin with personal decisions. I believe many people underestimate how much influence they already possess. They wait for permission. They wait for perfect circumstances. They wait for someone else to act first. Meanwhile, opportunities pass by. Opportunities to encourage. Opportunities to serve. Opportunities to lead through example. Opportunities to improve the lives of others. Those opportunities exist today for all of us. The world has enough critics. The world has enough spectators. The world has enough individuals explaining what is wrong. What it needs are more people willing to become examples of what is right. That is where transformation begins. Not with grand declarations, not with dramatic promises, with consistent action. As I considered these three practices, I found myself thinking about the people listening to this message. Some are leaders, some are workers, some are parents, some are pastors, some are business owners, some are students, some are retired. Each person occupies a different place in life, yet all share something in common. Every person will eventually leave behind a legacy. The question is what that legacy will be. That thought brings me to the final message I want to share. Because positions differ, circumstances differ, backgrounds differ, but there is one reality that ultimately unites every human being. And it is a reality none of us can escape. The central message is simple. The world does not need more people who merely talk about values. The world needs people who live them. Stop judging so quickly. Help someone who is struggling. Live according to what you believe. Because examples change lives far more effectively than speeches ever can. My final message to you. As I come to the final part of this message, I want to speak to you as directly and honestly as possible. Perhaps you have agreed with some of my words. Perhaps you have disagreed with others. Perhaps certain parts have encouraged you. Perhaps certain parts have made you uncomfortable. That is understandable. Whenever we discuss faith, leadership, integrity, and personal responsibility, strong emotions often emerge. These subjects touch the deepest parts of our lives. They affect how we see ourselves. They affect how we see others. They affect how we understand our purpose. But before we finish, I want to leave you with one final thought. A thought that has remained with me throughout the years. A thought that becomes more important every time I reflect on life, becomes more important every time I reflect on life, leadership, and the future. I do not know who you are. I do not know where you are listening from. You may be a president. You may be a pastor. You may be a business owner. You may be a teacher. You may be a farmer. You may be a factory worker. You may be retired. You may be struggling through one of the most difficult seasons of your life. You may be enjoying success. You may be somewhere in between. Our circumstances are different. Our experiences are different. Our responsibilities are different. Yet there is one truth that eventually reaches every human being. No one takes wealth with them forever. No one takes power with them forever. No one takes fame with them forever. No one takes titles with them forever. No one takes influence with them forever. These things feel important. Sometimes they are important, but none of them last indefinitely. History reminds us of this constantly. Powerful rulers have come and gone. Wealthy individuals have come and gone. Famous personalities have come and gone. Entire empires have come and gone. The passage of time eventually touches everything. That reality is not meant to create fear. It is meant to create perspective. Because once we understand that material success is temporary, another question becomes more important. What remains? When the speeches are over, what remains? When the applause ends, what remains? When positions change, what remains? When wealth disappears, what remains? I believe the answer is found in how we treated people. Did we use our influence to help others or only ourselves? Did we use our resources responsibly? Did we act with integrity when dishonesty seemed easier? Did we show compassion when someone needed it most? Did we contribute more hope or more suffering to the world around us? These questions matter. They matter more than many of the things that occupy our attention every day. Because legacy is not measured only by accomplishments. Legacy is measured by impact. How many lives were improved because we were here? How many people experienced kindness because we crossed paths with them? How many opportunities were created because we chose responsibility over selfishness? How much good remained after we were gone? These questions transcend politics. They transcend religion. They transcend nationality. They touch the heart of what it means to be human. I often think about the kind of world we will leave behind for future generations. The children of today will inherit the consequences of today's decisions. They will inherit our successes. They will inherit our mistakes. They will inherit our values. They will inherit our priorities. That responsibility should encourage all of us to think carefully. What example are we setting? What lessons are we teaching? What future are we helping create? The answers are being written every day, not only through major decisions, through ordinary ones. The way we treat neighbors, the way we conduct business, the way we exercise authority, the way we respond to challenges, the way we choose between principle and convenience. These daily choices accumulate. They become habits. Those habits become character. That character becomes legacy. This is why I believe integrity remains one of the most valuable qualities a person can possess. Integrity follows us everywhere. It influences every relationship. It influences every decision. It influences every opportunity. And unlike money, power, or status, integrity does not depend upon circumstances. Anyone can choose it. A wealthy person can choose integrity. A poor person can choose integrity. A leader can choose integrity. A citizen can choose integrity. A young person can choose integrity. An older person can choose integrity. The choice remains available to all of us. The same is true of compassion. The world often speaks about strength, and strength is important, but compassion is also strength. Choosing kindness in a harsh world requires strength. Choosing forgiveness when resentment seems easier requires strength. Choosing service when selfishness is rewarded requires strength. These choices are not signs of weakness. They are signs of character, and character ultimately matters more than image. Image is temporary. Character endures. Reputation can be managed. Character must be lived. Public perception changes. Character remains. That is why I encourage every person listening today to look beyond appearances. Look beyond titles. Look beyond public recognition. Look beyond social status. Ask deeper questions. Am I becoming the kind of person I claim to be? Am I living according to my values? Am I treating people with dignity? Am I contributing something positive to the world around me? These questions matter, and they matter for all of us, including me. especially me, because leadership does not remove responsibility. Leadership increases it. The greater the influence, the greater the obligation to use it wisely. The greater the authority, the greater the duty to remain accountable. The greater the opportunity, the greater the need for humility. These principles continue guiding me, and I hope they continue guiding you as well. If you call yourself a follower of Jesus, then I want to leave you with a challenge. Live like Jesus. Not perfectly. No human being achieves perfection. But sincerely, consistently, authentically. Do not merely admire his teachings. Practice them. Do not merely quote his words. Apply them. Do not merely discuss faith. Demonstrate it. Because the world notices examples more than declarations. People observe actions more than slogans. And authentic faith becomes visible through conduct. If you believe in honesty, practice honesty. If you believe in compassion, practice compassion. If you believe in justice, practice justice. If you believe in service, practice service. Allow your life to become evidence of your beliefs. That is where credibility begins. That is where influence begins. That is where transformation begins. I know these expectations are not always easy. The world often rewards different behaviors. The world often celebrates selfishness. The world often encourages pride. The world often values appearance above substance. But difficult paths sometimes lead to meaningful destinations. And meaningful change rarely occurs without effort. That is true for individuals. It is true for families. It is true for nations. And it is true for the world. So I leave you with one final reflection. If this message made you uncomfortable, do not dismiss that feeling too quickly. Sometimes discomfort reveals something important. Sometimes it points toward an area requiring attention. Sometimes it invites growth. Perhaps that is why honest conversations matter. Not because they always feel pleasant, but because they create opportunities for transformation. If parts of this message challenged you, ask yourself why. If parts inspired you, ask yourself how you can apply them. If parts encouraged reflection, continue reflecting. Growth begins with awareness. Awareness creates choices. Choices create change. And change creates possibility. The future is not determined solely by governments. It is not determined solely by institutions. It is not determined solely by leaders. It is shaped by millions of individuals making decisions every day. That includes you. That includes me. And that is why this conversation matters. The central message is simple. Tomorrow, none of us will carry wealth, power, status, or fame forever. What remains is the way we treated other people. If you claim to follow Jesus, then live as he taught. Do not merely read his words. Become an example of them. And if this message has disturbed you, challenged you, or made you uncomfortable, perhaps there is a reason. Perhaps it was meant for you. After everything I have shared today, I have come to understand something very simple. Power alone cannot save people. Money alone cannot save people. Fame alone cannot save people. What truly helps human beings endure difficult times is faith, compassion, integrity, and goodness. The world today carries too much pain. Too many families have been affected by conflict. Too many communities have been divided by hatred. Too many people have lost hope because of greed, corruption, and selfishness. My sincere prayer is that better days will come for Burkina Faso. I pray for a brighter future for Africa. I pray for the people of the United States. And I pray for every person around the world who desires peace, justice, and hope. Let us reject what is evil. Let us walk away from greed. Let us refuse hatred. Let us resist the temptation to exploit others for personal gain. Instead, let us return to a path of kindness, honesty, forgiveness, and service. Let us choose to help one another rather than destroy one another. Let us remember that every human life carries value and dignity. Even during the most difficult moments, I ask you not to lose hope. Darkness may appear powerful for a season, but light continues to exist. Hope continues to exist. Goodness continues to exist. And for those who keep faith alive within their hearts, there is always a reason to continue moving forward. I believe God is with us. God is with Burkina Faso. God is with Africa. God is with America. And God is with people everywhere who seek what is right. If you also believe in a better future, I invite you to leave a prayer for the world, for your family, and for future generations. And continue walking with us as we spread hope, compassion, and faith to more people across the world.